This is a debrief of task 4 from sample assessment 1 of applied management accounting. So we're given quite a bit of information here. So part of the assessment is you absorbing all the information. So let's have a look at what they've given us. Roasted Limited is a medium-sized coffee manufacturing company that produces 2 products, ground coffee and coffee beans. The company has invested in new integrated technologies throughout all sections of the business, from the use of robotics in the production line through to reporting software in the accounting function. A traditional absorption costing method is currently used, and it has been suggested that activity-based costing may be more appropriate following the introduction of improved technologies throughout the company. The following information regarding the company has been provided. So notice we have data for the first product of our ground coffee and separately for our coffee beans. So for our direct materials, we can see we spend £10 for the ground coffee and £11 for the coffee beans. So that's quite similar, isn't it? But notice that they have different levels of labour time required. So a labour hour costs £10. And we can see that we use 4 hours for the ground coffee. So that's going to be a total of £40. But we use more labour time for the coffee beans. So that's going to cost us £60 per unit. Then we're also told that we've got a planned production of 40,000 and 30,000 hours respectively. And then based on their new processes, we can also find out that we've got some inspections. So we've got 680 inspections for the ground coffee, and there are fewer inspections, only 120 for the coffee beans. And then the IT support, so lots of IT support for the ground coffee, as we can imagine, because there's a process of grinding the coffee, isn't there? So we need more robotic time and more IT support. So 20,000 hours of IT support for the ground coffee and only 4,000 for the coffee beans. And we're further told that for these different items, we've got inspections, haven't we? And inspections cost 400,000 in total. And then we have our IT support, and IT supports cost 960,000. So notice that we've got like a matrix of information here, that we've got data for inspections and data for IT support and data for the ground coffee and coffee beans. So because of that matrix, we've got to be careful that we're picking up the right numbers for the right part of our answers. So in part A then, it asks us to calculate the direct costs and the production overheads per unit. So notice it's per unit, and you've got to be careful in your question because it might ask for the costs per batch, or it might ask for the costs per hour, or whatever it's going to be. So make sure you're focusing on the right thing. So we're looking at the cost per unit for the 2 products, the ground coffee and the coffee beans. And first of all, we're using labour hour absorption. Okay, labour hour absorption. So in our table then, we're just looking for the direct costs. So both of our materials and labour are the direct costs. So we can see therefore that we can, for the ground coffee, that's £10 of materials and £40 of labour. So that's going to be a total of £50. And then for the coffee beans, we have 11 and 60. So that's giving us a total of 71 for the coffee beans. And then what about our production overheads? So what we're going to do then is recognise that in total, our production overheads amount to £1,360,000. And what we need to do is absorb that cost into each unit. So we need to identify then, well, how many units are we going to make? Well, it's not on a unit absorption costing, it's based on the number of labour hours. So what we need to do is work out what's the total number of labour hours we're going to be using. So for our ground coffee, so we're going to make 400,000 units. but each unit will take 4 hours. And then also for the coffee beans, we're going to be making 30,000 units, and each unit takes 6 hours. So notice in the workings, we're actually putting units and hours, and we think that's a useful technique, because if you don't do that, if your scrap paper in your assessment is just filled with numbers, but you don't know what number relates to what, then it's very easy for you to confuse yourself. So it's a good idea to include what is that number. Is it an hour? Is it a unit? Is it a kilogram, or whatever it's going to be? So based on that, then we can now multiply that all together, and that's going to tell us what's our total labour hours for the whole of production. So for the ground coffee, that's going to be 160,000 hours, and for the coffee beans, that's going to be 180,000 hours. So in total, that's going to be 340,000 hours. So that tells us, therefore, that our overhead absorption rate, which is going to be our planned cost, divided by, in this case, our planned hours. So our planned cost, that's going to be the 1,360,000 that we calculated just now. And we're going to divide that by the 340,000 hours. So that gives us an overhead absorption rate of £4 per hour. Again, notice that it's per hour, not per unit. So again, that would give us a different result. So on that basis then, we know that for the ground coffee, it takes 4 hours to make a unit, and we're going to cost that at £4 an hour. So that's going to give us a total of 16. That's our overhead absorption. So again, we can work out that's the 66 total for the whole unit. And then what about for the coffee beans? It's going to take us 6 hours to make 1 unit. It costs £4 per hour. So that gives us an overhead cost of £24. Again, when we add up the total, that's going to be a total cost of £95. And so what we're saying then, every time we make a unit of ground coffee, it takes us 4 hours, and therefore we're going to include a cost of £16. So the plan is that if we make all of these units, we will include all of that cost in our cost of sales. And so that's the idea of the absorption rate, isn't it? We're trying to recognize that we've got these production costs that are not directly linked to a particular unit, and somehow we need to include them in our cost of sales. So we're going to do that based on the number of hours it takes us to make each unit. Right, what about part B of the task? So calculate the inspections and IT support costs per unit for ground coffee and coffee beans. But now we're going to be using the activity-based costing method. And in this case, it wants our answer to 2 decimal places. So they've given us a table to complete. So again, we've got those 2 different types of product, our ground coffee and our coffee beans. Again, our direct costs, well, we've got those numbers from before. So that's 50, isn't it? But remember, the question wants it to 2 decimal places. So you do need to make sure that you are doing that. Otherwise, the computer-based exam software just won't give you your credit. But now what we need to do, though, is work out, well, what is the cost of the inspections and the IT support for each of these? So rather than taking the whole 1,360,000 and just absorbing that into each unit, we're now going to look at the individual costs and think about, well, we need to spread the 400,000 cost between the number of inspections. And similarly for IT, we need to be able to spread the 960,000 cost between the various hours of IT support. So what we need to do then to think about that, let's look at our inspections to begin with. So what we need to do is work out what is the cost per inspection. So we know that our cost is 400,000. Now notice I'm writing all the zeros here, and I think that's good practice as well. It's easy that when we're dealing with thousands, just to skip the 3 zeros from our calculations, but potentially that means that your answer may be out by a factor of 1,000. So yeah, especially when you're dividing one number by another number. So yeah, so we want to use our 400,000 here, and then we need to also consider, well, how many inspections are there? Well, the total number of inspections, we've got 680 plus 120, so that gives us a total of 800 inspections. So our cost per inspection is 400,000 divided by 800, so that's going to be £500 per inspection. But we can't put that into our answer, can we? Because what we need to do, though, is work out, well, how many inspections are there per unit? So that's the next thing for us to consider. What's the number of inspections per unit? Because that's the cost that we want to include in our cost card. So if you think first of all about our ground coffee, so how many inspections are there per unit? Well, we've got 680 inspections in total, but how many units are we going to make? Well, there are 40,000 units. So 680 divided by 40,000, so that tells us that there are 0.017 inspections per ground coffee unit. And if we multiply that by the 500, that tells us that the cost is £8.50 per unit. Okay, so that's the figure for the ground coffee. Well, what about for the coffee beans? Let's work that out now. So yeah, we want our inspections per unit, but for the coffee beans, so we have a figure of 120 inspections. And we want to divide by the 30,000 coffee bean units that we're going to make. So 120 divided by 30,000, so that gives us 0.004 inspections per unit. And again, we want to multiply by the £500, and that's going to give us a cost of £2 per coffee bean unit. So again, notice in our workings, we're trying to be really clear by writing down like our inspections per unit. It's very easy for you to divide the wrong number by the wrong number, just get it sort of the wrong way around. But if you're actually physically writing inspections and units in your workings, you're less likely to do that. And we know what our cost per inspection is, so we want to know how many inspections there are per unit. Again, if we think about it in terms of that, we want to know what is our cost per unit, and that's going to be the cost per inspection multiplied by the number of inspections per unit. Okay, so you just look at the formula of the calculation here. So when we multiply cost by divided by inspection divided by unit, these two numbers would cancel each other out. So that gives us our cost per unit, doesn't it? That's what we're aiming for. Okay, so we need to do the same then for our IT support. So for our IT support, we need to think about what is our cost per support. So our total cost, we've got the 960,000 cost, and then we need to divide by the total number of hours. So we provide 24,000 hours of IT support, don't we? A total of 24,000. So 960,000 divided by 24,000. So that tells us that we have a cost of £40 per hour. So again, similarly, we want the cost per unit, don't we? We don't want the cost per hour. So again, so what we need to do then is work out what are the number of IT hours per unit. So we're going to start off by looking at the ground coffee. So we spent 20,000 hours supporting 40,000 units. So our IT hours per unit, we've got 20,000 hours divided by 40,000 units. So that gives us half an hour per unit. So we multiply that by the cost per hour. So that means that we're going to have a cost of £20 per unit for IT support. So this would be automatically calculated. So notice at the bottom, look, we've got this figure here. So yeah, in the exam-based software, this would just add it up for you. So we've got the 50 plus 850 plus 20. So that's going to be a total cost of £78.50 to make 1 unit of ground coffee. And then what about for our coffee beans? So again, we want to work out our IT hours per unit. So we've got 4,000 hours and 30,000 units. So we've got 4,000 hours divided by 30,000 units. So that gives us 0.13333 hours per unit. Now remember, in the AAT approach, that we need to use the number in our calculator here, not a rounded version. Okay, so I'm not going to multiply 40 by 0.13. Yeah, I've got my number in my calculator which says 0.13333333333, and I multiply that by 40, and that gives me a cost of 533. Okay, so you do need to be careful with how you plug the numbers into your calculator. So again, if I add my column up now, again in the exam, this would be done for you, we get a cost of 78.33 per coffee bean unit. So the last part of the task asks us to discuss the differences between the costs using the traditional absorption costing method and the activity-based costing method. So it wants us to compare our results in the two tables. Why are they different? So the approach for you here is just write what you can see. Describe what you can see in your results. Now let's bear in mind that possibly you've made some mistakes with your calculations, but the instructions for the markers is that they should mark your answer based on the figures you've calculated, not necessarily the correct figures. So just because you may have a bit of a panic with these first two parts, A and B, it doesn't mean you can't answer part C. Just have a go at part C using whatever numbers you have. Now we've got 6 marks available for this, so what we want to do is say 6 things. The more you write, the better mark you're going to achieve. So the best way to do this is just look at the two tables. What can you see? Just describe what you can see. So if you look at the first table, the first point we can make is that using the traditional absorption costing method, the cost of the coffee bean is £95 per unit, which is much higher than the cost of the ground coffee unit, which is only £66. Now, why is that? Well, part of it is that the direct costs are much higher. Well, why is that? Again, if we just scroll back a little bit more, we can see in terms of materials, actually, there's not a huge difference, is there? So the main reason why the cost of a coffee bean is higher is because there's more labor time. We need 6 hours of labor time for a coffee bean unit compared with only 4 hours for a ground coffee unit. So it's 50% more labor intensive. And remember, for the traditional absorption costing, because it was more labor intensive, we used labor hours as the basis for our absorption. So the extra cost of labor in direct costs also means that we absorb more costs for our overheads as well. So yes, that's why we have a significantly higher cost for our coffee beans. However, when we do our activity-based costing, the costs are very similar. So it seems to have smoothed out our cost per unit. Now, if we think about our direct costs, remember that hasn't changed. Coffee beans are still more labor intensive, and therefore our direct cost is still much higher for coffee beans than for ground coffee. But when we're grinding the coffee, we're using a lot more of the robotic technology, and therefore we have a higher number of inspections and much more IT support. So when we are absorbing the production overheads based on the activities, then the ground coffee has a much higher cost for inspections than coffee beans because there are more inspections and therefore it takes on a greater share of the cost. And because the ground coffee is much more robotic and requires much more IT support, then yes, we are including £20 per unit for a ground coffee, a higher proportion, because it's much more IT intensive. So we can see that when we're allocating the production costs based on how we're generating those production overheads, that we have a much different way of spreading the cost between the two products. And arguably, the activity-based costing is a much fairer approach because it's recognizing that the ground coffee is more IT intensive, so it should take more of the IT cost. The ground coffee has more inspections, so it should take more of the inspection cost. So based on the discussion we had in part C, we can also answer part D as well now, which asks us to explain the benefits that the activity-based costing system may have over the traditional absorption costing system. So we've seen from our discussion, haven't we, that we've got a much more accurate cost per unit now, rather than the inflated cost for the coffee beans compared with the reduced cost of the ground coffee. So yeah, we have much more accurate cost per unit, and these costs now reflect the nature of the overheads. So yeah, they reflect the nature of the inspections and reflect the nature of the IT support, rather than it just being based on volume of production. And because we've got a better and more accurate cost per unit, that means our managers are going to have a better understanding of the costs, and therefore we'll have better cost control. And finally, for part E of the task, explain how the use of technology can provide a benefit to the company's operational control processes. And this is talking about technology in general, not specifically just about costing. But with any technology system, in general, technology makes us more efficient because we can increase our output for a reduced amount of input. So with the automation and robotics, we may be able to roast more coffee beans, we'll be able to grind more coffee with less input from the staff and from the general business. So we're going to increase our efficiency, we can also improve our output, but also thinking back to our controls, we'll hopefully have better data. So we'll be able to work out better what is the time per production unit. And if we have better data caused by the technology, that will lead to better decision making as well.